Hello, everyone, and welcome to the the Headline series for the IRC. Today, we have the pleasure of interviewing Emily Benson. Emily Benson is a senior associate non-resident with the Europe, Russia, and Eurasia program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and head of the strategy at Minerva Technology Futures, where she advises transatlantic clients on geopolitical risks that affect trade and investment decisions, primarily relating to AI, semiconductors, and other critical technologies. She previously served as a senior advisor at the U.S. Department of Commerce in a unit focused on geopolitical risk in critical supply chains. As a Pembroke Hill alumni, Emily will be back in Kansas City to deliver a lecture called Trade, Technology, and Power: Geopolitics in a Fragmenting Global Economy on May 19th at the Casey Chamber Boardroom in Union Station. Emily, how are you doing today?
Hey, doing well. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to re-engage with the KC community.
Of course. First of all, thank you so much for joining us. As fellow members of the Pembroke Hill community, it's especially exciting to have the chance to speak with you about your career and work. Your career has focused on the intersection of technology, trade, and national security, areas that many people don't naturally connect together. What first drew you towards this space, and why have those fields become so intertwined today?
Well, that's a great question, and I think something that is broadly reflected in the direction of travel of US policy over the last, let's say, decade. And what happened is that post-Cold War period, the US redoubled efforts to support an international set of trading rules aimed at promoting free and fair trade and investment. So the thinking here was that by growing the level of interconnectedness between economies, the likelihood for conflict would reduce and the rising tide would rise all boats. And there has been a growing number of events that have sort of reversed course, both in Republican administrations and with Democrats, and now back to Republican leadership. And this evolves from the recognition that reliance on a single market, in this case, China, actually produces tremendous vulnerabilities that require risk mitigation policies. And this particularly relates to the COVID-19 supply chain disruptions, where in Kansas City, for example, the inability to get auto semiconductors led to furloughs at manufacturing facilities. And so there was a very acute recognition that the inability to acquire or maintain sufficient supplies could actually imperil the economic resilience and security of the United States. And so, in that sense, the thinking is in order to keep the proverbial lights on, we really need to have resilient supply. If one country can go offline, either because of a pandemic or geopolitical conflict, or as we see actually this week in the lead up to the meeting between Presidents Xi and Trump, a much more assertive stance by both parties to control trade and investment in the bilateral relationship. So that's long-winded, fancy language for saying, look, things can go very much awry. And both under Biden and both Trump terms, the thinking is now, well, how do we bring additional manufacturing back to the United States in order to make sure that we can produce the stuff we really need in the event that we encounter a supply shortage? Here, that begs a set of questions. Well, what do we prioritize? What are the important sectors? And here, that's the subject of very fierce debate.
Perfect. Yeah, you mentioned technology supply chain, and you worked on technology supply chain resilience at the Department of Commerce during a time when supply chains, like you said, have become a part of everyday conversations. What do you think the United States has realized about the connection between economic dependence and national security over the past years?
Yeah, so I touched on some of this already, but there is a growing sense that outside of the civilian economy, so moving into the defense industrial base, a lot of the inputs that we use, for example, even in F-35 fighter jets, come from high-risk vendors. And this includes, for example, Chinese mature node semiconductors. The thinking is that if you're importing from a country that could use a kill switch or could embed surveillance technology in your end products that you adopt, that in itself could create a vulnerability. This goes back to the idea that the US really wants to build additional control over its own inputs. And here we see a very concerted effort, both under the Inflation Reduction Act, which is, I think, a poorly named package that actually was partially about climate and energy, but very much about de-risking from China on energy supply chains themselves. And then, of course, the Chips and Science Act under Biden that sought to subsidize additional chip capacity here in the US. Moving to the current administration, they're using a completely different set of tools. Instead of inducing the additional supply from the domestic side, they're trying to use demand side economics to get the private sector to shoulder some of the burden of onshoring, to say, look, this is how much of a certain product we need upstream. This is the quantity that needs to be onshored in order for us to be able to survive a much higher tension geopolitical environment.
Yeah, you perfectly mentioned the defense industrial base. A lot of my research and interest have been focusing on that, especially how technology has shaped global power. The United States Navy in the Indo-Pacific, for example, and the need for amount of ships to counter China. Why, from your perspective, why do you think America's defense industrial base is having many shortcomings and we're not able to produce, the amount of weapons or ships or fighter jets that needs to follow strategic needs?
So that's a very complicated question with a lot of opinions. People write their PhDs on this. There's several books going after very specific use case studies to look at where we've gone awry. And there are a couple of major factors at play. One is that we've spent a generation procuring the wrong hardware. So if you look at the eastern front of Ukraine, something like north of 85% of all Russian casualties have been carried out by small Ukrainian drones in the past 1 year period. And so the human to human artillery function is significantly reduced. And that has moved into more automated, more advanced technologies across the kill chain. We are not currently able to produce drones in the quantity that Ukraine is because we've spent a lot of time with this obsession on large fighter jets, on aircraft carriers that take a much longer period of time to build and in turn require much longer lead times for supply chain purposes. So that's one area is that we've procured the last generation of technology. There are a lot of changes in the past 13 months that have at least attempted to move us in a different direction towards expediting the use of artificial intelligence, including in targeting technology. There are a lot of changes underway that kind of disfavor in some ways the defense industrial primes. So that's one bucket. The second bucket is on acquisition policy by the Pentagon. And if you've tried to contract with the Pentagon before, you'll know that the process is extraordinarily arduous. The documentation process is long. The Pentagon doesn't always give you a clear sense upfront of the number of fighter jets it wants or how many drones they seek to have by the end of the decade. And that in turn makes it very challenging for US private sector entities to put those forward requests in. For example, how many magnets they're going to need in the next fiscal cycle. So some of this has a very material impact. Again, we've seen the consolidation of a couple of units at the Pentagon under the current administration, and so there are very much efforts underway to mitigate these lack of resiliency issues across the chain.
Yeah, and you mentioned semiconductors and advanced technologies. They're clearly a part and center of geopolitical competition, especially between the United States and China. You look at companies such as TSMC from Taiwan. I remember, I think it was last year that they introduced a project, an investment project in Arizona for building factories, which furthers the situation between all three of the countries. So my question is, why have technologies like chips become such an important strategic issue, and how much of modern life on the day-to-day actually depends upon them?
Yeah, so semiconductors power the modern economy, as you note. They're used in everything from hyperscale data centers that feed or produce large language models to small drones or even to certain trash cans, where you hold your hand over the trash can and the lid opens. So that's a sensor-driven semiconductor process. They're used in cars in kind of inconspicuous ways, like making your car windows go up and down. And that's actually itself an interesting problem because the Dutch company Nexperia was severely cut off by China in 2025. And what happened is it was owned by a Chinese CEO. The Dutch accused that person of wrongdoing. There were some funneling of funds to support another entity. The Dutch dusted off this old 1951 statute to go in and claw back Nexperia from Chinese control. And Nexperia itself wasn't really a geopolitical icon of the Netherlands, right? It was this kind of sleepy producer of chips that make car windows go up and down. But the Chinese retaliated and they halted all exports from Nexperia facilities in China. Well, that had very serious knock-on effects across auto supply chains. Even the Honda facility in Mexico had to temporarily halt production because you can't make cars nowadays without windows going up and down. So in some cases, we see the saturation of the entire economy with semiconductors. Would we as people survive if we had to roll our own windows up and down? Probably, but hey, now it includes chips, and now we have a dependency on a foreign entity production facility for additional chips. So that's one angle. The other is that governments and companies that produce at the leading edge have additional capabilities to build frontier AI systems. This is only part of it. If you actually look at the full AI supply chain, you need energy, you need advanced data centers, but then you need infrastructure that can handle data flows and energy flows. Then you need people, in many cases still human resources, to go in and create that cloud or that app layer on top. And so what you see is that semiconductors are a very important part of the equation that have given the US a leading edge on advanced AI for now, but they're certainly not the only part of a very advanced equation.
For sure. Pivoting into a different direction, we often hear like phrases such as economic security or technological competition. The point of this interview is to again get the student perspective and have students have a better understanding of national security. Many students still think of national security in military terms. How has the definition of national security evolved in recent years, in your opinion?
So I'm actually just wrapping up a semester at Georgetown where I taught for the first time ever a class called the Geopolitics of Technology. And on day one, I asked them whether you are primarily a consumer or primarily a producer in the kind of data economy here. And I think that's an interesting take on a new lens for national security. So every time we engage with the internet, we leave behind us this trail of data, your consumption habits, your emotional well-being, your private conversations with chat. All of that is cataloged into what is a highly effective profile of you as an individual. Well, it turns out that foreign actors can very easily buy these data sets via data brokers. So under Biden, there was the first ever attempt at controlling US personal data on the outbound state to control bulk data in by the profile of active US military personnel. So their fitness and health, digitization as a potential in some to creating that security barrier for American individuals.
For
So
sure.
I think the long story short is that emerging technology, or in some cases technology we've had since at least in the civilian commercial sense, earnestly since the mid 1990s, there are national security implications that coincide with proliferation of these everyday technologies. And we're just at the forefront, especially with more people to people interaction with artificial intelligence systems. We're really beginning to see the risks that come with an unregulated digital environment. And so you compound that with reliance on hardware systems that are increasingly vulnerable to government intervention, both here and abroad, and that creates a much more precarious chain overall.
Artificial intelligence is advancing incredibly quickly and becoming a major geopolitical issue as well, like you've mentioned. From your perspective, what opportunities or risks surrounding AI should young people be paying more attention to?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think being educated about what AI is and isn't is very helpful. There's this, of course, AI hallucinations and sycophancy where I'm sure we've all seen friends and family get way too into their chatbots, and it's kind of weird at the base. So taking personal steps to ensure that you're using AI responsibly to the extent that you are is helpful. In the geopolitical context, this sense that the US is in a race with China is very charged politically, and I would encourage everyone to make their own determination about the way that's playing out. I'm a little bit skeptical of the argument that we're in a race that can be won because a race concept in itself denotes a finish line. And foreign policy has no termination date. History goes on. We already litigated this. And so I think if you get caught up in this idea that we'll take a great leap forward or we'll conquer the next frontier. Our work is done. I'm a little more suspicious about that because we've seen economies continue to innovate and grow over time. And so there are two different lenses for people to take. One is on the personal engagement level. Are you keeping a clean data trail? Do you understand the products that you're using? Are you using it responsibly and not too many hours per day? But then on the flip side, are you able to formulate your own opinions about something that is at the very heart of geopolitical competition? And the stakes are very high. We haven't had a pure superpower in a very long time. And this will set the future course of our foreign policy. If you cannot sufficiently defend your own stance, maybe do some additional reading.
Right, right. Thank you for your insight on that. Now, transitioning more towards your personal story, you've worked across government, think tanks, and now the private sector. How has moving between those different environments changed the way you think about policymaking and global challenges?
Yeah, so I've been very fortunate in DC to get to see policy from so many different angles. The most interesting, to be frank, and it's been very surprising for me, is the private sector angle in some ways because think tanks and the government alike struggle to get concrete supply chain data from the private sector. And so working with them much more closely has enabled a more granular understanding of where companies have concerns or reliances, or which companies are taking a very proactive approach to mitigating risk versus companies that have a little more of a hands-off approach. And we tend to bucket companies into the private sector or AI companies in general, and they're actually quite different. They all have different personality traits and vibes and different approaches that come from the top or come from deep within these companies. And so it's been interesting to see just how diverse they are in their approaches. But that being said, think tanks are also really great. They provide an opportunity to get outside of this constant news cycle where the Chinese government issued a blocking rule, and these are the implications for the Southeast Asian energy trade, and we need to know everything in 72 hours. Think tanks can provide a little bit of a broader zoom out on dynamics, and part of the core function of think tanks is to do the thinking that the government can't do in many cases. And so organizations like CSIS will put out these reports that say, for example, here actually is our independent assessment of Russian defense industrial base capabilities several years into the war in Ukraine. And here's what we think the USG should do in response. And so they provide a menu of options to the government to help the government do better. And then, of course, at the end of the day, it goes back to the government to implement, carry out, use its best judgment to build the toolkit to make us a safer and more resilient economy overall. So they each play a very important and interfacing role with each other.
Yeah. Finally, as a last question, for students who are interested in international relations, public policy, or global affairs or technology risk management, but they're still figuring out their own path. They just have, small interest in these areas. What would your piece of advice be?
There are a couple of things to do. First is contradictory to the type A personality, which is you don't need to have a concrete plan. If you say, look, I want to be the deputy assistant secretary for the Russia desk in the State Department when I'm 45. Okay, that really constrains you to one lane between now and then. And maybe by the time you're 45, we've deprioritized Russia in favor of North Africa, for example. And so keeping a lot of flexibility built into your career can be more rewarding and keep you more in line with the stuff that's headline news coming out, if that's what you'd like to be working on. I've been very fortunate throughout my career. I've not really had a concrete plan, and I've been able to take the positions over time that were most appealing to me. And here is a head versus heart situation where whatever feels intuitively most interesting is probably the best choice because if you take something that looks better on paper or that your parents recommend that you take or your advisor knows someone there, okay, sure, but you'll be competing with someone who's naturally really passionate about that role, and so you'll look less effective. If you take your passion role, you'll kill it. You'll be really great in the role. And so you want to do things that naturally make you enthusiastic. So that's my big set of advice. The other very practical thing is when you're working this hard in a role in Washington, you're working 12 to 14-hour days. So this is the only thing you're doing with your life. If you hate what you're doing, like you really need to have fun during the day, or it's going to be kind of a slog. So that's bucket one. Bucket two is to make a list of people to reach out to, and this can be anywhere around the country. I recommend creating a list of 30 to 40 people that look cool on paper. Who has a good job? Who's out there writing about stuff that you think is like, whoa, super interesting, haven't heard that hot take. Perfect person for you to reach out to. If you do a bunch of those calls over the span of the summer, for example, that can A, give you a lot of really good insights about what's going on in that policy space, and then B, create a very concrete network for you to activate as you're applying for jobs later on.
Well, thank you so much for your insight and your words of advice. I learned a lot from this conversation about semiconductors, technology, and supply chains, and I hope all our viewers did as well. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you.